I would also ask you to mention the Canadian context. We're wearing our red square today in solidarity with the protesters in Quebec, of course. But the Canadian government really aligning themselves with this Zionist policy, this policy of destabilization. They've pledged more than $1 million to promote democracy in Syria. That's going to the kinds of groups that they claim they're fighting in Afghanistan, of course, which is an irony. The Canadian government just yesterday, or the day before yesterday, met with the so-called Friends of Syria, which many Syrians are saying are actually the enemies of Syria, who are ensconced in the former imperial metropolis that used to dominate Syria, of course, Paris, France, where we're looking at the former colonial power acting as a kind of safe haven for these groups these days. And so the Canadian government is promoting the opposition forces, the so-called opposition forces who are in Syria, who are seeking to weaken and oust the incumbent government led by President Assad, who is loved by many Syrians. Yeah, so I was also going to ask you about Aaron, about the Canadian government's role in this debacle. They've pledged $1 million or more to these sectarian groups in Syria under the rubric of so-called democracy promotion. They have been meeting with the so-called Friends of Syria, who my Syrian friends here in Calgary call the enemies of Syria, who are the forces that are seeking to destabilize and create sectarianism in Syria, the very forces who many would say are actually anti-democratic and actually represent the same Islamist tendencies that the Canadian government is saying they're fighting in Afghanistan, which is of course an irony. And so the Canadian government are deeply in bed with the imperialists, are deeply in bed with the Sykes-Picot II that's being implemented in the Middle East, of reordering the Middle East ensemble. And so how is it that the Canadian government can justify sending millions of taxpayer dollars to kill students in Syria, kill students in Iraq, kill students in Afghanistan, when, as we're wearing our red square today, we know they can't afford to fund tuition fees and scholarships for students here in Canada?
Well, I find it very interesting that a lot of the non-aligned countries do have a free education or next to free education, and it's really not that hard to do. And here in Canada, our government is opposing a legitimate demand of the students, and not just the students, but the people. Now it has become broader than just a tuition issue. It's about democracy now. It's about shared values. It's about the ability to create our own reality based upon how we want it. And a lot of people are realizing that, as a result of capitalism, Western capitalism, the way it is now, we're allowing the governments to imperialize other countries. So the best way that we can struggle against imperialism abroad is by fighting the corruptions of capitalism here. Because if they have less of our money, less of our resources, if we have more power on the ground here, they have less power over there. And I think it's important that we realize that there's a connection between capitalism and imperialism. They're basically one and the same. Lenin wrote an article back in 1916 called Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. And this is just one of the examples of how a lot of the progressive movement has been, really taken for a ride, because they don't really understand and they haven't analyzed, what is capitalism, what is imperialism, how do these countries operate? And, whether it is Libya or Syria, I know Libya and Syria are both a lot of tribes involved. It's a tribal country, and within the context of imperialism, tribalism doesn't work in the same way that it did before imperialism. So I mean, we can't look at it as a friend or foe kind of framework. We have to understand that if we're to stop the balkanization of the Middle East and North Africa, then you need a strong anti-imperialist force at the helm, that's going to bring and coalesce these groups together, and it's unfortunate that we in the West have this Eurocentric version of what democracy is, and I'm sorry, but democracy isn't the way that white rich people say it is. Everybody has a right to build their own society in the way in which they want. Where they have self-determination, where they have sovereignty, and where non-interventionism is respected. And this is being destroyed. It's been destroyed with Libya. It's being destroyed with Syria. It will be destroyed with Hezbollah. Israel already has plans in place to attack southern Lebanon, to destroy Hezbollah, once they hope that when they see the fall of the regime, if that happens. And then what happens next? Then it's Iran. Then what's next? Then it's Venezuela. So you see all these non-aligned movement countries, these countries that are involved in non-aligned movement, being targeted. And why are they being targeted? Because they have the courage to stand up and say, we have a right. We have a right to develop ourselves in a way that is not under the demands of Western imperialism, is not under the dictates of the United Nations system of accounts. That we have a right to create our own reality. And we don't agree with your Western capitalist society. And we're going to try to build something different. So this kind of white man's burden of we in the West are the police force of the world has been propagated by the ruling elite. And it's really unfortunate that a lot of the progressives out there have fallen for it, have bought it, have swallowed it, hook, line, and sinker. And it's time for that to end, because if we want to protect self-determination, if we want to protect self-determination here at home, then we have to show that we protect it with people abroad too. If we want to protect the self-determination and the sovereignty of the Quebecois who are fighting, then we have to protect it abroad too. If we want to protect the self-determination of the First Nations people, we have to protect it abroad. If we want to protect the sovereignty of our own country, as bad as it may be, and as fascistic as the Harper government is, we have to be willing to protest it ourselves, not call on Big Brother to the south to come and save us, the largest purveyor of violence in the world. What kind of irony is that? That's ridiculous, So we need to stand up for our own self-determination.
Yes, indeed. And so, you mentioned imperialism being an extension of capitalism. Capitalism and imperialism are kind of two sides of the same coin. And one thing I've noticed is that one reason Israel can get away with murder, literally with murder, and that this quite a radical policy of reordering the Middle East that many are calling a Sykes-Picot II. Of course, in 1915 and 1916, British and French statesmen reordered the Middle East ensemble out of the ashes of the crumbled Ottoman Empire. And that was, of course, crystallized in 1919 at Versailles, and the Middle East was reordered. And I would say that, obviously whoever owns capital gets to dictate the terms of imperialism. And I would say that it's a controversial point to make, but, many of the Jewish community in North America have been very successful in terms of business, in terms of entering the cerebral classes in the professoriate. There are many journalists who are partisan to Israel for ethnic and ideological reasons. And so is it, like you look at the Forbes rich list, and like half the richest people in the US happen to be of Jewish ethnicity, right? And likewise, I gather Israel has more billionaires per capita than any other country in the world. And so I would say I'm being consistent with Marxist principles, consistent with left-wing principles, socialist principles, by opposing Israel, opposing those who apologize for Israel in the North American media, opposing the capitalists who buy lawyers to attack anyone who even do lawsuits against those who criticize Israel. That's happened. And of course who are actually the ones plotting for this Sykes-Picot II in the Middle East. And so would you say that it's being racist and anti-Semitic in order to oppose capitalists who support Israel for ethnic and ideological reasons, or is it actually being consistent with Marxist principles to oppose that, say, 50% of the ruling class who really take an interest in the Middle East because they care about Israel? I would say you're a capitalist here in Calgary who, I don't know, like your business is making bread or something, or your business is cutting down trees in British Columbia. They are a class enemy of you and I, but they're not really that involved in Middle East politics. So there's different factions in the ruling class. and some have more blood on their hands than others when it comes to the Syrian debacle, the Holocaust against the Palestinians, and the ongoing destabilization of the Middle East. Of course, Iraq, in my view, was misdiagnosed by the left. It became a mantra that it was a kind of war for oil, that it was all about stealing Iraq's oil. But when you actually look at the net effect of what happened in Iraq, it appears to have created civil war and sectarianism, Sunni, Shia and Kurd fighting each other in order to weaken one of the more secular and prosperous countries in the Middle East. And we see that happening again, of course, in Syria. And so to what extent, how can we talk about this as left-wing people to still portray ourselves as anti-racists, as progressive people, as people who oppose imperialism, oppose racism, whilst also addressing the fact that the Jewish community have been very successful in business, in academia, and many positions that allow them to have hegemony over the discourse on when it comes to the Middle East?
I think one of the things that we should do is realize that capitalism is no respecter of peoples or cultures when it comes to dictating who gets on top. It's those people that have better opportunity as a result of there not being equality of opportunity. Those that are born with a silver spoon in their mouth get to climb the ladder, per se. And it could have very easily been, Christians that did that. It could have been easily people from Islam that are in that position. It just so happens that as a result of rigid rules that religions held true to with respect to usury, that we find ourselves that a lot of the capitalists are from Jewish origin. What we need really to do is we need to realize that capitalism is transnational, and Western capitalism, regardless of who's on top, needs to be resisted because it does not create a society that is equitable. It doesn't create a society that where workers have a say at all, and it doesn't create a society that I want to be part of. It creates a society where we all divided, and rather than fighting the main enemy, which is the capitalists in the ivory towers, the capitalists that are promoting this Western hegemony, we need to be resisting that, and regardless of the ideological the religious beliefs of the people on top there, regardless, if we don't fight it, then there's going to be more imperialism. Like I said, if we don't stand up and fight it here, it's not going to just be Syria, it's going to be Iran, it's going to be Venezuela, and the attempts of the countries out there who want to build a multipolar world rather than a unipolar world, that's going to be destroyed.
So how can the people in the Middle East, the people in the Middle East have been put down now since the Sykes-Picot Agreement, almost a century. They've basically been slaves to Western imperialism. How can they learn from the Latin American experience, where now the people of Latin America are waking up? And Chavez has said that Colombia is the Israel of Latin America, but I would say that it's not as bad as Israel, in the sense that Colombia is not trying to obviously dominate Latin America in the way that Israel is seeking to dominate the Middle East. And so how could the Great Awakening in Latin America that we're all viewing with sanguinity, how can that be used as a model for the people of the Middle East who are also undergoing transformations currently that are very important? And how can they how can the Latin American experience, the Great Awakening in Latin America, be emulated when you have this nuclear armed ethnic nationalist belligerent power ensconced in the heart of this Arab and Muslim part of the world that so desperately seeks self-determination?
Well, first of all, as somebody from Canada, I think we need to resist the Harper regime because it's fairly clear from Harper and his conservative crew that they put the interest of Israel before the interest of Canadians, which is treasonous. And, if we had capital punishment still on the books, they theoretically could be tried and hung for their crimes. Our sovereignty comes before the sovereignty of another country, especially when you're the head of our country. As much as you may like or dislike Harper, he has a responsibility. As much as you may disagree or agree with the election results, I personally believe they were fraudulent. The fact is, he has his hands on the levers of power, and he has a certain responsibility to put our interests and our sovereignty ahead of another country. So as long as he is putting the interests of another country ahead of ours, we have to resist that, and we have to make it clear to all Canadians that this is what's happening, that our Prime Minister is not our Prime Minister. Our Prime Minister is bought and sold by, in the pocket of the Likud party, and we need to make that clear. And we need to reclaim the sovereignty of us before we can actually talk about sovereignty and self-determination of other countries.
Yes, it is surprising, isn't it, that the Canadian Prime Minister is so one-sided and displays such veneration for the Israeli state. Indeed, not just for the Israeli state, but for the most reactionary elements within Israel. People who are extremists within Israel are treated as normal and legitimate statesmen by the Canadian Prime Minister. Do you think it's got a lot to do with the fact that, the capitalists in Canada, you look at Shoppers, it's the shop that has a monopoly on pharmaceutical products here, it's owned by a Jewish Zionist. You look at Chapters, the lady who owns that goes to Bilderberg, she's a Jewish Zionist. You look at Save On Foods, the main supermarket in our part of the world, the owner's a Jewish Zionist. I mean, you look around and the fact is that community's done very well, disproportionately well, far better than people from other ethnic groups in North America. And we know that Stephen Harper represents the party of the rich. And so is that how we're to explain this tendentious approach to the Israel-Palestine conflict, where it would be more reasonable, surely, for the Canadian Prime Minister to take a more nuanced position? We have many Arabs and Muslims in Canada, many of whom are sympathetic to the Palestinian plight. They want emancipation for Palestinians. And could this explain why we see the Canadian Foreign Minister, John Baird, Minister of Foreign Affairs, John Baird, he went over to Paris yesterday, was in Paris yesterday with the so-called Friends of Syria. He's pledged money to Syrian sectarian groups. He's pledged he's not taking a nuanced position on the Syrian debacle, but rather is actually siding with those people who are having a war against the Syrian people.
Oh, totally. And